Thank you very much. It's a great honor to be here moderating this panel this morning at the second day of the Abu Dhabi Strategic Debate. I thought we had a really excellent day of sessions and discussion yesterday, and we want to try to continue that here this morning. So I'd like to thank the organizers and also thank our panelists, who I'll introduce in a moment, and all of you for attending this morning on time and promptly, despite the fact that we're in the widest hotel in the world. So I know the commute time to the conference venue is probably longer than is often the case, but we're glad to have everyone here. Our panel this morning is on power in a digital age. And what strikes me about this session is that it's not about digital power per se. The next session will look at cyber power specifically and some of the technicalities and detailed developments in the cyber realm. But today what we're really looking at is the role of power in our contemporary era, much of which is defined by technology, much of which is defined by a digital revolution over the last 20 years. And what we're asking is really, has that changing technological environment changed the nature of power itself? Who does it benefit? Does it benefit certain actors over others? Does it reward the already powerful states, or is it a leveling of the playing field? What are sort of the power dynamics that leaders and people should be thinking about as we try to navigate this very uncertain future that we heard so much about yesterday? We would like to keep this as conversational as possible and really to bring in all of the panelists on a constant basis, really, to talk about the different dimensions of this issue. And we'd like to come back to some of the issues that were raised at the end of yesterday and throughout yesterday, in fact, on U.S. strategy, on the sort of nature of the regional order here in the Middle East, but then also more generally, what do some of these changes and developments mean for the world as a whole? So we are joined today by 6 speakers, which normally seems very daunting, but compared to yesterday when there was 9 speakers in some of the sessions, I feel very lucky that we have a little bit more time here today. Firstly, we have Andrey Kortunov, who's Director General of the Russian International Affairs Council and President of the New Eurasia Foundation in Moscow. Secondly, we have Pavel, who's the Vice President and Director of the Brent Scowcroft Center on International Security at the Atlantic Council in Washington. Laipson is a distinguished Fellow and President Emeritus of the Stimson Center, also in Washington. Giampiero Giacomello is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Bologna in Italy. Johan Eriksson is the Research Director of the Swedish Institute on International Affairs. And Liu Kang is the Professor and Director of the Duke Program of Research on China at Duke University and a member of Academia Europaea. So welcome all. Thank you very much for being here this morning. And Barry, if I could start with you, and just looking back to yesterday's final session and the earlier discussions, one of the things that really came across was that what's happening here in the Middle East is that the region is racked by civil wars and conflict, sectarian tension, that is sort of the defining challenge of our sort of era of these several sort of year period. Much of this seems very old. You know, these are old problems, old tensions, old divides. And so my question really is, what is particularly new about any of this? Is there something about the technological or digital revolution that makes this different, or are we dealing with something, that leaders of the past would have recognized? And to put it in sort of in a bit of a gimmicky nutshell, when the president or leaders try to sort of figure out ways to deal with this over the long term, do we need more sort of programmers who are capable of working in the digital space, or do we need more historians who actually understand what's happening in the region?
Well, thanks, Tom, and my huge appreciation to Dr. Ebtisam for arranging just a fantastic conference. I've already learned a lot yesterday, and I'm really looking forward to this discussion and the rest of the day, but a really monumental effort. Tom, as usual, you asked the perfect question, and I think the answer is, it depends, and we don't know yet. But let me explain a little bit. I mean, I think for the first time ever in human history, almost anyone anywhere can see what's going on somewhere else. You can pick up your phone right now as I'm speaking and know what's going on in the capital of Bangladesh. I mean, so people everywhere see what's going on, and that creates, I think, some new dynamics. Do we know exactly what those new dynamics are at this point? How they will play out in major geopolitical issues such as those we discussed yesterday? I don't think we can answer that question yet, but what I do know is we've already seen some examples where non-state actors can have very significant effects on national, regional, and global issues. The United States, most obviously, was surprised by 9/11, and we certainly see ISIS using some of these tools in ways that I think has catapulted them well past Al-Qaeda in terms of their efforts. And when you think about ISIS, let's just take that as an example. Their entire business model is reliant on some of these tools. If you think of them as a corporation, and Jared Cohen had an excellent piece in the most recent Foreign Affairs called Digital Counterinsurgency. And his main point was if we do not address ISIS in the digital domain, we will fail, because their business model, all of their corporate units, their human resources and recruiting, their production, their customer service, their operations, their branding, their marketing, all of that is completely reliant on a very systematic, structured approach to using social media and using other technological tools to advance their agenda. And they're winning. And they're winning because of their dominance of this domain. And if we don't reverse that and get smart about it and look at a strategy and not just tactics like counter-messaging, then we will not succeed. So that's just one example, Tom. And so at the Atlantic Council, we call this a Westphalian plus world, where states aren't going away anytime soon. They're very powerful. We've seen that play out in Ukraine, in Asia, in this region. They're still extremely powerful, and they're also using some of these tools. But you cannot ignore the fact that there are now other actors that are also using these tools, in some cases to level the playing field, in other cases not. So in short, my answer to your question is we need both programmers and historians, and we probably need them to work together.
Great. Maybe we'll find some historical programmers or programmers who also do PhDs in history, but I wouldn't hold my breath on that for the moment. But thank you very much, Barry. That's an excellent way to start us off. And Andrey, if I could turn over to you and ask, in terms of how it looks from Russia, in a way, Vladimir Putin sees himself, I think, as being at the receiving end of some of these technological developments on color revolutions and sort of the danger from below. And now Russia is a very active player in Syria. So how do you perceive this? How do you think this is sort of perceived from Moscow? And is this sort of a new age with new challenges, or is this really a continuation of sort of old historical trends?
Thank you, Tom. First of all, let me also say that I'm honored and I'm grateful for having a chance to be here and to address this distinguished audience. This conference, I think, is very timely and very important. As far as our panel is concerned, I would like to draw your attention to the composition of the panel, which I think reflects general perceptions about the distribution of digital power in the world. We have 3 Americans here, plus American moderator. We have 2 Europeans and a Russian. But we don't have anyone from India. We don't have anyone from the region. And I think that this is clearly an omission because digital power is diffused. And definitely the Middle East is becoming a major playground for the manifestation of the digital power. Let me say just one thing about state and non-state actors responding to what Pavel has said. In my view, the difference between the situation today and the situation, let's say, 50 years ago, is that in history we saw a hierarchy of power. And the problem of convertibility of different types of power didn't exist. Usually, the military power was, of course, the most important. You have a war, then you sign a peace agreement, you use political power, then you have a trade treaty or something like that, and every single type of power was easily converted into a different one. Right now we have a disconnect. You can win a war, you can utilize your military potential, but it doesn't mean that you will be able to turn this military power into a political victory, which we saw in this region many times. If you have a political victory, it doesn't mean that you can create a viable state. And even if you have great economic relations, like relations between China and Japan, it doesn't mean that you will be able to use it as political leverage. From this viewpoint, definitely Putin, and let me turn to digital power as such, I think that he showed that this perception that you cannot control digital power, that digital power favors non-state actors, is not always true. The way how state manipulated internet, social networks, how the state was able to sell its narrative to the Russian public is very impressive. And let me remind you that the Russian segment of internet is third in the world after English language and Chinese language. So it's not a trivial task to have an impact on this audience. It is really sophisticated, well-educated, quite diverse, but that tells you that something about the ability of traditional state institutions to maintain control over large constituencies using new instruments of power. I think this is an interesting phenomenon.
Thank you very much. And on your point at the beginning on the sort of composition of the panel, I'll note that we do have somebody from Sweden, and knowing the technological sort of advantage that Sweden has, I think that sort of reflects some of the new superpowers and Italy, of course. So that I think is a sign maybe of optimism about Europe's future. But if I could turn to Dr. Liu next, because you work on China, obviously, and be very interested in your view about how this is perceived in China. And I really asked the same question that I asked of Barry and Andrey, but is this sort of perceived as a new challenge with new, really a sort of revolutionary, time with very different conflicts and tensions than we had in the past? Or is this sort of a continuation of some very traditional, tensions and conflicts?
Yes, absolutely. There's a tremendous new challenge that China has faced in this digital age. There are several main dimensions to the challenge. I would very briefly say something about the international challenge China has faced. Obviously, there's cyber terrorism that China and the United States and other leading Western powers have been discussing over the years, and a lot of disputes. The Chinese President Xi Jinping recently visited the United States, and it's pretty high on their agenda. Somehow they didn't really reach much of a conclusion in terms of handling the, so-called cyber terrorism, issues like how to handle, the hackers and security issues. So that's only part of the story. I think the larger issue for China to face this digital challenge is more or less a domestic issue rather than kind of international issue. I think Barry just mentioned this is a new age for people to see anything, everything, and everywhere. Somehow that's not exactly true in China. People can see probably a lot of things. You may see people see everything, but not anywhere, not everywhere. Because everybody knows that there's a great firewall of China, namely this, cyber censorship, which is very powerful. It's growing more powerful. This is sort of like a catch and mouse game. It's never end. So China is faced with enormous issues domestically. So much so that people, think that China's internet somehow should be changed into China's internet, not intranet, but internet, because the government is determined to curb the free flow of information domestically, not internationally. So when we talk about non-state actors, true, the Chinese government, the state, the party, is doing everything they can to manage, so to speak, to manage the digital world, the cyber world. However, these non-state sectors express stronger nationalistic sentiments towards international issues, because the government mostly controls the free flow outside China, the free flow of information outside China. So that somehow did not really help alleviate this kind of nationalistic sentiment because of lack of information. So the Chinese public, oftentimes in dealing with international issues like the disputes over South China Sea, relationship between China and Russia, and so on and so forth, the government is really very much concerned how to somehow put this under control. So that's somehow China's faced. To summarize, is more of a kind of domestic issue rather than international issue.
Thank you. That's really fascinating. And Ellen, if I could turn to you next and sort of ask you to respond to that, but particularly the notion that some states think that they can basically this gives them a greater means of control. Right. And I think really one of the key issues is is that sort of version or model right, or are we actually seeing a diffusion of power where those efforts will be completely futile because the sheer dynamics of this at the grassroots level mean that something sort of fundamentally is changing and governments can't exercise the amount of control that they may prefer?
Yeah, thank you, Tom. I think it's important to step back a little bit and realize that one of the characteristics of the digital age is really the empowerment of individuals. What we've been hearing about is examples where so-called strong states still assert control of the relationship that they have with their citizens. But really, it's a very different model in democratic countries where we celebrate the empowerment of individuals and where the state is lagging behind technology and really cannot control, is constrained by bodies of law about privacy, individual rights, civil liberties, et cetera. So I think we really have a quite wide spectrum of cases where how states perceive whether they can still hold on to some management of the digital world or whether they've in fact lost control. And let's be careful to not conflate control and strong. I think those are, states can be perceived as strong, but in fact they may be brittle because they have constrained too much their citizens' access to information. So I'd also like to just expand a little bit on this point about access to information. Doesn't necessarily lead, we assume it's a net positive because more information means citizens or other groups can make choices, make more informed choices. But we also know that there are costs and dangers to access to information. And let's use the example not just of how the Islamic State uses digital technology to its advantage, but how it plays out in the recruitment of young people, where we see even at the family unit or the schools or communities don't always know that people have access to this global net in ways that are changing behavior, changing social relationships, and empowering, in this case, a bad non-state actor in ways that when the state then tries to say, oh my goodness, we have a problem here, what are we going to do? There are serious legal constraints on how much they can walk back the technology. So I think it's a very complicated set of issues where the pact between society and state is changing, and that states very often are not prepared for all the consequences of the digital age.
Thank you very much. And that I think gives, I would like to move on from that to come to Giampiero and ask you really about this issue of that Ellen raised about recruitment and how it's easier for ISIS to recruit beyond traditional challenges, and go to sort of a related question, which is in terms of the civil wars we are looking at in the region today. How does technology and cyber really change the nature of those civil conflicts? and who are sort of the winners and losers, within those? I mean, are groups like Daesh, are they empowered by these changes? Does this sort of fundamentally change the way we should look at some of these challenges?
Thank you, Tom. I know that there's another panel on cyber power just after this one, and I don't want to take away, topics that they may discuss. But I think it's important to make a clarification about the fact that there are still superpowers in the cyber domain. There are states that have devastating capabilities in terms of cyber warfare, real cyber warfare, in the sense that we haven't really seen anything of that. The only example is considered to be Stuxnet that was used against the Iranian enrichment program, and it worked greatly, and that was 5 years ago. That was long ago in cyberspace. So that was the only example of capabilities of cyber warfare. So there are a few countries that have this tremendous capabilities. But aside from those few, depending on how you count, it's between 10 and 15 that are considered to be really capable in this area. There's another thing to say that there are, as it came out of the conversation so far, is that there are many more individuals that are, they are called technology-empowered individuals that can actually, of course, they don't have the capabilities of sovereign states, but they are capable of doing some damage. And what's really new, you asked the question about what has changed in terms of the civil wars, is that the capabilities of these technology-empowered individuals are more and more integrated with other forms of warfare. There's a lot of talking now about, hybrid warfare. And what's new is the fact that the capability of creating some, of provoking some damage and depending on the type of attack and so on and so forth. But what's really new is that even if you have a low level of capabilities in cyberspace, you could do something, but not a lot. But if you integrate that with other forms of irregular warfare, and then it's a force multiplier. And in this specific case, non-state actors have been much better, much more innovative than states. They've been able, mostly because they have fewer resources, they've been able to capitalize on this and integrate all these different types of warfare. That includes, of course, the capability of, I'm not talking only about denial of service attacks and so on and so forth, but, if you use that, you couple that with, what used to be called propaganda, now it's called perception management or information operations and so on and so forth. And you integrate that with, guerrilla warfare, with terrorism and so on and so forth. So, and if you are capable of creating a comprehensive strategy, then, you're much more powerful. And in this area, as I was saying, is, non-state actors have been much more innovative. And for sovereign state, this is a challenge, a major challenge, because most of sovereign states, are used to deal with the threat coming from another sovereign state. So how to, there have been centuries of ways to respond to this type of challenges. But this is really new. And we've seen that more and more in civil wars around the world. There's a lot of speculations about the fact that that's basically what Russia did with Crimea, this type of approach. And and if you couple the capabilities of a non-state actor with the sponsoring by a state actor, well then it's it's really a changing element in the game.
Great, thank you. And Johan, if I could build on that and come to you and really ask the question, who benefits in this new digital age? I mean, it seems to me that, one of the arguments which we just heard is that it really benefits sort of weaker non-state actors. It's a leveling of the playing field. Others would say that it sort of empowers the already powerful, because big states, get new tools that they can use, and they use them more efficiently and effectively. I mean, there's no, accident that Stuxnet was, a U.S. Designed, weapon. So my question really is, should we think differently about sort of the distribution of power, given the changes in technology?
Thank you. That's a good question. Yeah, who benefits? Well, in the early days of the internet age, there was a lot of hope and a lot of thinkers and arguments that with the internet and how the internet is disseminating across the world and more people get access to it, that would have sort of a almost revolutionary potential, so liberating, democratizing potential. And that was perhaps a little bit naive, since it was implied that technology per se has sort of a liberating value, and it doesn't. I mean, digital technology, smartphones, surveillance technologies, communication software, and everything else, they are neutral when it comes to politics, and that's my basic point. So, and these are dual use by nature or multiple use. So the line here goes between those who are tech savvy and those who are not tech savvy, and that implies both understanding how to use it for your own purposes or not. And I mean, today we are all users basically. I mean, who doesn't have a smartphone these days? For instance, all of the refugees coming from Syria today to Sweden and other countries, they use their smartphones to keep in touch with their relatives and looking up information on where they're going and so forth. So it benefits them. But basically, I would say who benefits? Well, those who really understand how to use this, and you need to have sort of technological knowledge. And you can see now there's a trend towards greater authoritarianism and censorship, unfortunately, so internet freedom is threatened around the world, which is not just comes out of fear of this revolutionary potential in the use of digital technology, but also, and this has to be stressed much more, it's really bad business. I mean, it's bad. I mean, people do want to do business with, for example, China, but it's really difficult because of all the obstacles, you're transmitting information and financial transactions and everything else. And you want to do this quickly and large data, but it's sometimes blocked. So that would be
terrific. Thank you. And I would just note that this has been a really terrific opening, not least because we're completely on time. So we have a lot of time for discussion until we go to the audience. So please just, now that we've had everyone sort of have an initial say, jump in and sort of just catch my eye, because we want to try to keep this as free-flowing as possible. Ellen, if I can turn to you, I saw you yourself and Barry both wanted to come in on the point that Johan just raised.
I just wanted to underscore two things that you said, Johan. One was that really we should think of technology as neutral. We should not fall too much in love with it and think that somehow it's the solution to all of humanity's problems. When we look at the drones, for example, people thought that drones would be more targeted, less lethal, less collateral damage, but now we discover that the use of drones in civilian space can create all kinds of accidents where there'll be civilian casualties in a non-combat environment, so that we usually can't anticipate all the ways in which technology will develop and then be used and applied by independent actors in ways that was not perhaps the original intention. The other is that the innovation comes from the private sector, and that rarely, it used to be that the U.S. Department of Defense was a major engine of technological change and innovation, but over time that has shifted worldwide, I think, much more to the private sector. So very often these technologies are developed for a commercial purpose, and then they get adapted for many other uses. But again, the regulatory environment lags behind because the technology first first people experiment and see how many different applications there are, and then you realize you have to regulate. And just one last thought, on the global governance side, I do think that we see that the cyber world is a world in which the UN at its creation obviously could not have possibly anticipated, and that the global architecture is really weak when it comes to how do we develop rules of the road or mechanisms for international cooperation in the use and the distribution of these technologies.
Yes, absolutely right, I think. That's a huge challenge. But Barry, you also wanted to come in here.
Yeah, I wanted to complicate your job a little bit. The title of this panel is Power in the Digital Age, but we're really only at the very beginning of I think, a period in history where digital is enabling not just cyber activities and not just communications connectivity, but there's at least 4.5 other things that are coming down the pike in the next 10 to 20 years that I think, future panels in ADSD number 17 will be talking about less about cyber and smartphones and more about these other digitally enabled technologies that are also very potentially impactful for this discussion about power, and is it really leaning more towards states or toward non-states. I mean, just the ones that are on my list are the revolutions going on first in biotechnology, where biotechnologists in Silicon Valley are now saying we're able to write the code for life forms. 3D printing, where people will be able to start producing things. The Internet of Things, which is coming even sooner, where billions of devices are going to be connected, including cars and other transport vehicles, but lots of other stuff. Automation and robotics, also extremely impactful. We're just now, I think, at the beginning period of how are those being used in warfare in novel ways. Swarms of drones. I heard the World Economic Forum had a little demonstration. I wasn't there, but where a little girl was controlling 2 different drones that were programmed to work together during one of their dinners or meals. And then finally, artificial intelligence, which is really, really getting a lot of attention these days. And how will that change security, society, and these other equations? So I think my main point here is, let's not only talk about 2015, let's also project a little bit, use a little bit of imagination, and try to get ahead of how these technologies, and I agree strongly with Ellen, how might they impact. We're going to guess wrong, but I think we need to start those conversations now. China, for example, edited a gene, and that caused a lot of consternation across the world, where the genetics revolution, the genomics revolution, which is being driven by digital plus bio, this also will have very significant implications potentially, and even in differential ways. So I think we should just, we won't be able to get a handle on all of it because we don't know, but I think we should expand the conversation because we're only at the very beginning of the digital age.
Thank you. Andrey?
I'd also like to emphasize that the digital revolution is just one of multiple revolutionary changes that we have in the world. We have the digital revolution, but at the same time, we have the mobility revolution, given the scale of migrations. We have a revolution in education, which is extremely important. We have a revolution in global finances. And I think that the most interesting opportunities and risks emerge at the intersection of these various social and technological trends. In this sense, the digital revolution, in my view, is a great amplifier. It amplifies both opportunities which emerge and the risks which are associated with changes. Unfortunately, in my view, we are lagging behind in recognizing the risks, and we tend naturally to emphasize the opportunities, but that might really compromise, the future applications of digital technologies. I think that indeed we might see a situation, a kind of new Ludism, a new attempt to curb technological progress because of the fear that it creates two serious threats for traditional lifestyles, for states as major actors in international relations, for certain political regimes, and so on.
I think that's a fascinating point. I'd like to bring others in. We'll come to you, Dr. Liu, 1 second. And just on this point of, how will states and countries react to these changes? And will they try to close off, or will they try to open up? Does, as Ellen said, this basically creates new challenges of governance? Does it create incentives for cooperation? Or is it really incentives for competition as countries worry about the future, worry about the uncertainty, and try to get an advantage? Because technologies, if they're not a level playing field, they can mix things up, and there are winners and losers, and everybody wants to be a winner, of course, so they want to be first, have a first mover advantage. But Dr. Liu.
Yes, yes. I guess one of the ways we should think strategically or creatively is not the traditional powers, how the traditional powers face the challenge and come up with their solutions. Rather, I think one of the issues we want to think about is actually the transformation of the traditional powers, for example, the state power in this digital age. What I mean is, this forum is debates mostly about international affairs, international relations, international politics. When we think about the state power, the traditional power, versus the non-state power, the private sectors, seems like that we have concentrated too much on the sort of one-dimensional issue, that is the political power, the ideological issues. Like China is a classical example. Ideology plays a leading role in creating all this tension between China's censorship, cyber censorship, and versus this kind of values, universal values for free press. And however, if we think about the digital age as a diffusion and even diversification of power distributions, we may find probably other ways to reconfigure, the power as in this topic in the digital age. That is, we not simply have the, political power, ideological power, the ideological issues, the military issues. We think about the technological, scientific use of the internet, and of course the commercial use. China is another, in this case, is a good example. China does not really have a uniform strategies at to develop its power in the digital age. China has pushed greatly for the commercial use and technological use of the digital means, the internet. Like Alibaba is a good success in Wall Street. And of course, there are problems in dealing with China in terms of the norms and regulations. But I believe, the internet, the digital age, does create the new opportunities. If we somehow diverse our views into different aspects of digital age, rather than concentrating exclusively on the political, ideological, those are all the traditional, global issues. Think more about the opportunities created by the internet, the digital age, to benefit human beings at large. So that's something we can think about.
Thank you. Thank you. Johan, did you want to come in on this? Or?
Well, yes. Just go back to one thing you said in the beginning about programmers and historians. And well, the internet has the capacity to turn every individual into their own historian. And
I'm not sure what
So
historians would say about that, but it's okay.
Yes, and it has the potential for greater pluralism, and that is what I think the countries with a large deal of censorship see as a major threat, since we all can communicate with each other and produce your own truths.
Can I press on you on this a bit, though? I mean, does that sort of mean that everyone has their own version of reality and history? I mean, is that part of the, problem in that stuff is sort of siloed? You can, nationalists can find plenty to sort of reinforce their narrative online. Grievances are sort of exacerbated. There's a mobilization with any sort of minor crisis that can be elevated quite quickly as people are reminded of why they should be so angry about something, and it gives them sort of an added, impetus to take direct action. Or is it where people sort of question and, question the state media, question their leaders, and it sort of has a positive effect of more sort of skepticism?
Well, it is more and more difficult to navigate in the digital world, and the big question is what information is trustworthy and reliable, and which is not. And since it's not just the traditional media that is operating in this sphere, but everyone else can provide their own information, and you find that. So that is the very difficult thing to navigate.
Giampiero, did you want to come in here? Or?
Yes. There's following up what Johan was saying, that there's a reaction. I mean, the first instinctive reaction to these challenges for many states is that, okay, we close down, we're trying to control as much as possible, which is hopeless in a sense. It can succeed here and there on the short term and so on and so forth, but in the long term, this type of trying to delay or stop this type of developments is just hopeless. But I also wanted to try to come up with some sort of answer to also the challenges that Barry was mentioning, in different fields of technology, not only in cyberspace. Well, there's the answer is not actually closing down. The answer is not controlling. The answer is not, trying to protect the status quo. I think that a much better answer is that, how can you exploit that? And, it was mentioned the role of the private sector and so on and so forth. I think that the best answer is education. That's the best answer to this type of challenges, that you have an educated people accessing all these different technologies. The problem with education, I know it sounds like a trivial thing, oh yeah, education is the answer for everything and so on and so forth. But even more so, in the digital age, even more so, it has always been the case, the right answer, but even more pressing now in the digital age. And the point is that, it's paradoxical, the fact that the problem with education is that among the state expenditures is the one that produces results at with such a long delay. You invest now and you reap the results, you have your return in 10 or 20 years. So no government no politician is really interested in investing a lot. Defense, welfare, healthcare, and so on and so forth. They provide much more, much quicker results in electoral terms and so on and so forth. So investing in education is the last thing, but it's the most important thing, and it's actually the only answer.
Thank you. So, Barry, I know you wanted to come in, but I wanted to throw out another question, and you can address that or what you originally wanted to say, and then I think we'll go to the audience pretty soon. But the question is just to tie this conversation back in a way to what we were talking about yesterday, because one of the striking themes of yesterday, I think everyone will agree on, was the sort of concern, particularly here in the region, about U.S. power, U.S. strategy, that the U.S. is somehow disengaging from the Middle East, disengaging from its alliances. That may or may not be true, but what I wanted to ask was, does this technological revolution and the means by which states, particularly very powerful states like the United States, can project power more easily through drones and other sort of technologies, does that actually facilitate retrenchment? Like, is it possible to have what we call an offshore balancing strategy? Is that more feasible now than maybe it was 10 or 15 years ago? You know, because you can remain offshore and just project power in on occasion to take out some, you know, bad guys, you know, whenever sort of they appear. And, you know, what are the, you know, what should we be thinking about in terms of U.S. grand strategy over the next sort of 5 or 10 years as these technological changes accelerate?
Great, thanks, Tom. I mean, on the first question, I think the answer is no. I mean, I think it enables countries like the United States to be more effective at the tactical or even operational level, but you're not going to solve major challenges affecting this region or other regions by sort of offshore balancing, not really being involved in just using a military instrument here and there or a diplomatic effort or another national tool. So I don't think that approach makes much sense, and I think if you look at even the history of the last 3 years, not great results, as you know, even if all you agree with is that there is a perception of U.S. disengagement, you know, even if that's the minimum. On your broader question on strategy, which is exactly what I wanted to just mention briefly, and you and I both run strategy projects at our respective institutions. I mean, I think all of the issues we've been discussing suggest a different approach to national strategy. It suggests it suggests continuing to pursue stability in certain areas, and no one likes violent change. But it also suggests adding to stability a significant set of activities related to harnessing all of these changes, to harnessing the dynamism that's going on in global affairs. So at the Atlantic Council, we have this proposed strategy, it's available online, called dynamic stability, which is if all you're doing is trying to pursue stability and you're ignoring all of these changes, all of the revolutions that Andrey mentioned, all of these other massive changes going on, then you're not going to achieve your goals. So instead, you should try to look at those changes and how can countries harness those changes for their national advantage? How can they harness that dynamism? And in the long run, it's the knowledge economies that harness these types of technologies and use them in ways to diversify and strengthen their economies and their economic base, which is only enabled by education. In the long run, those are the most powerful countries. So the ultimate answer to your question about power in the digital age, if you don't look to harness these types of changes, then you will, in the long run, your power is going to diminish relatively.
Thank you. Would anyone else like to come in on this question of sort of the U.S. role in the region or Russia's role maybe in the region and how sort of technology might change or the digital revolution may change how we think about that, Ellen?
Well, I guess just to complement what Barry said and go back to your earlier question about how individuals can also adapt digital technologies to their own preferences. I do worry a little bit about fragmentation and how the domestic politics of countries can get stuck because we can develop our own digital profile. So we're only receiving the things that we more or less have already selected as compatible with our own worldview. You can get sort of information subcultures that never connect, that they're never looking at the same information, so that like if you buy something online and you'll be barraged with ads to buy the same thing again and again. Political information comes in these streams, and I think while power at the national level may be, as Barry suggested, I worry about fragmentation of political preferences at the domestic level that actually is another subtle way that states are getting weaker, not stronger.
Great. Thank you. I think we'll go, unless there are any sort of last interventions, we'll go to the audience. And what I would ask is that our panelists have been very pithy in their comments and have kept it to a few minutes on each occasion. So please don't make any speeches. Keep it to the point and try to ask a question rather than have a sort of a long contribution. So our first question comes from Mohamed Al Naqbi.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My question to Barry. Now we know that ISIS possess a lot of power on the ground and a lot of power in cyberspace. With such a distracted country like Syria, how this small group managed to get hold of the infrastructure in order for them to transmit through the cyberspace and work so strongly in attracting a lot of people from outside, first. Second, do you think that Turkey plays a big role in supporting them in cyberspace? Thank you.
Thank you. Great question. Barry, do you want to take that?
Sure. Although there are people here who are more expert than I on this question. And I would strongly commend the article that I mentioned as the real answer to your question. And so I'm just borrowing sort of a summary of the analysis. But this is the age of individual empowerment, as Ellen said. So this is a perfect, and very dark situation or case study where a group can use these types of tools, this type of connectivity, to achieve the types of goals that we've seen and to paint a vision that is extremely antithetical to the visions of all of the peoples represented in this room. And so they can do it by lots of different methods. And the article I mentioned goes into sort of 4 different ways that ISIS is organized online. There's a central command at the very top that could be targeted both online and in physical and in the real world. There are, at the bottom, sort of people who are inspired by but not technically linked with the network, and so those also are part of their broader enterprise. And then there's 2 other levels of actors, including at the 3rd level, I believe, sort of automated bots on Twitter that are very, very effective at amplifying messages and ensuring that they reach a very wide range of Twitter accounts. So some of these nodes can be targeted with some precision, and one of the types of measures that the article recommends is, for example, publicizing the arrests of some of the key people once those people are located and identified after investigation. Publicizing those arrests, making it clear that playing a role in this network is ultimately not going to be very helpful, in addition to all the other things one needs to do in cyberspace and in the real world to deal with ISIS, which can be discussed later. And then in terms of Turkey, I'm not really, I'm not informed enough on their particular roles to answer the question.
Would anyone else like to come in on this question of ISIS's sort of capability in cyber?
Well, if I might, I think that what ISIS does shows not just a degree of commitment, but also a degree of professionalism. And it involves also a lot of funding, because when they cut professional videos, it really costs money. It costs money, and they should have access to sensitive technologies. And this is, I think, a problem which has to be addressed. Probably, our intelligence is not working good enough. We cannot block the channels of technology transfer to ISIS. Maybe we should work harder on blocking the financial flows, because this is a serious enterprise. This is not something that you can do in your garage. This is something that requires a very sophisticated, very professional, very expensive services, and this is definitely something that requires more attention.
Thank you. I saw Johan next, and then Giampiero.
Just a quick comment on how ISIS communicates. Well, it's not, even if ISIS itself is a hierarchical organization to a degree, it's also understood that the internet is not hierarchical and it uses that to its advantage. So even if you strike and take out one communications node, one communication center, that doesn't destroy their means of communication through digital means. So we have my colleagues have found in Sweden, Swedish social media, people communicating in support of ISIS in Swedish for example. So this is, even though the warfare on the ground is taking place in Syria and Iraq, the warfare in the digital world takes place everywhere in the world.
Thank you. So I just noticed we now have 7 people on the list, so we're going to be very brief. But if, Giampiero, you want to come in very quickly?
Yeah, just very quickly. I wanted to add that, as Johan was saying, that focusing on infrastructure and technology is the wrong problem. It doesn't take geniuses to do the rerouting. It all depends on what you want to achieve. But once you are outside the region, then you're done. And it doesn't take geniuses to do that.
Thank you. Okay, next question, Ali Al-Kheshaiban.
Actually, my question goes directly to Mr. Li from China. He speaks about the China and how they try to control the digital age. My question for him is that we know the effect of the China all over the world, but still China is not open with the other countries, especially when speak about the new media, about the Twitter, about the some of these new things that. So I'm not sure if China could control the Chinese people to be control their interact with each other, and for how many years China will stay to resist that interacting openly with the other countries, and what the things that China afraid of, that to have all these new media open for all the China people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Excellent question.
You know, I've been on the U.S. media trying to respond to the Chinese cyber censorship for quite a few years. I think the first time I was on the U.S. TV, CNN, that was like 10 years ago. At that point, my prediction is this is a losing war on the part of the state. Maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic. Now the state is playing a stronger role in controlling, or better still use various terms, harnessing, you know, the flow of information. So, you know, I'm not really sure how long China is going to stay that way, since the state is kind of tightening up. But my view on this issue is, now, you know, I'm not going to predict anymore that somehow is going to have a radical change, that all of a sudden there will be free access to information and so on and so forth. What I would say is, you know, back to my point, we're thinking about the new opportunities, this, you know, the transformation of the power, the political power, ideological power, especially in China. This you know, state has overwhelming power in almost every sector in China. But can, you know, digital age promote and open up more opportunities and new space so that some way, gradually, if not radically, things will change, things will happen. You know, things already happen. I'm just saying, you know, like in the commercial arena, China has tremendous dynamism and very anxious to open up and collaborate with the outside world. And China is no longer isolated in that respect. Science and technology, those sectors are, you know, the areas that things happen to somehow rechannel, I guess, diversify or divert, I would say to divert, the power that has been tremendously invested in the state political apparatuses. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. Our next question is from Robert Harward.
Thank you. I got to go back to the comments Giampiero made, where you talked about cyber activity being a force multiplier. I think if we haven't already turned the corner, we are turning the corner when in fact it's going to become the governing weapon system. in fact, because nation states have become so dependent on military, economic, and political power, the ability to use it, integrate it, is purely dependent on access and freedom of this access, that any adversary now is looking at it to be the governing weapons system. So if you look, so my question is to you, if you think we're there now or it's going to become that, how, if we today were able to completely deny, as a case study, ISI, the use of Daesh, the use of the internet, how would it affect their ability? Would that be a determining factor to preclude from the growing population they're able to attract, bringing them to nature, and just denying them economic tools they have? So that's my question. How do you think, if we use that as a case and we're completely able to deny that capability to them, what would the effect be?
Yes, quickly. It seems to me that thus far the tactics have been to try to block. And if it doesn't work, if it hasn't worked, it means that there's something wrong. So we should change tactics. So trying to block completely is wrong, and you cannot do it. I think we should reverse the equation and try to exploit ISIS capabilities of reaching people. And you can fake it. You can make it as coming from elsewhere. And you should play their games with their rules. Try to block is the state's reaction, it's the government's reaction, it's the natural reaction. Okay, we block and we control everything. No, it doesn't work that way. No, you should learn to play, state actors should learn to play the game, with the rules and tactics of non-state actors. And that's, this is demonstrated by the fact that thus far trying to block everything hasn't worked.
Thank you. Our next question is from Garrett Mitchell.
Aha, thank you. Clearly somebody who has work to do in the digital age. As I listened to this very fascinating conversation, I had this thought, and I want to pose it as a question to the panel, if I might. It seems to me that what we know about digital technologies is that they can bring people together, but they don't necessarily keep them together. That they create a plethora of communications opportunities, but they do not necessarily, or perhaps even at all, enhance people-to-people relationships. And so I want to take a twist on the title of this panel, which is Power in the Digital Age, and ask whether any of the panelists have an observation about how these technologies are affecting governance in the digital age.
Thank you. I think I can repeat the question. I'm not sure everyone heard it, but it was really how do these changes affect power and governance in the digital age? So what's the impact on governance? And if I could take that sort of opportunity really to come to the panel for a wrap up, because I think we need to finish up now. Is there any sort of final comments on what on Garrett's question, but also on what we've been hearing for the last sort of hour and a quarter in terms of the changing nature of power? So who would like to begin maybe with an answer to Garrett's question? Or I can call on people arbitrarily. Ellen.
So I think it's really interesting how governments have tried to adapt to the digital age, and let's just take an example, how the State Department tries to reach audiences around the world. So, there's enormous pressure to use all the tools of a younger generation, and sometimes it's very effective. So an embassy can get out a speech by an American official to the local population very, very quickly. There's more interaction between non-elites in countries where diplomats of any country here, would serve. So in the way it's democratizing, it's leveling the playing field, as we said earlier, but it can also be very clumsy. And I think you mentioned messaging and counter-messaging, and I think that, at least the US government in the age of terrorism, and maybe this will come up later in the day, has spent billions of dollars trying to get inside the heads and what's the vocabulary and what's the way of communicating to young people who've been drawn to radical causes. And I just don't think that's something that bureaucracies are likely to do well. So I think there really are some limits. If we outsource it to young people, will we get it right? So that it's a very interesting set of issues. I also think that that your point earlier about about is it changing the nature of relationships, and I appreciated that Barry said, particularly in the Middle East, there is no technology substitute for relationships. People have to build trust and understanding of each other through very, personal, cultural means, and I think that the digital age in some ways understands that, and in many other ways does not. So kids that are on their gadgets all the time, we're going to have different personalities and different sociological dynamics than generations that lived before. And I think we haven't thought through, and we can't understand fully all the consequences of this. I heard somebody recently refer to this as de-evolution.
Thank you. Andrey, do you have any final remarks?
Well, I'd like to respond to the last question. If you followed the Russian internet a couple of years ago, you might have had the conclusion that the country was on the edge of a revolution. There was so much criticism of the government, of the leadership, but what we noticed is that the gap between the online life and the offline life is growing. And this criticism, which is very visible in internet, is not necessarily something that would influence political choices of people in their day-to-day lives. So I think that this is one of the problems. The energies are channeled to internet, and they are not utilized in the offline life. And to some extent, I would even venture to say that networks are replacing communities, which I consider to be a very disturbing sign in the social development. But let me say that, getting back to the title of our panel about power, I think one of the major promises of the digital age is that power in these days is not as much about dominance, but rather about leadership. And this is a profound shift which ultimately should be beneficial to all of us. Like I think it was Lao Tzu who said that be the chief but never the lord. In the digital age, I think it is becoming more natural to become the chief but not the lord.
Thank you. Thank you. Johan, any final remarks?
Yes. Well, on the question on governance, how is this affecting governance around the world? And just a quick 3 comments.
Very, very briefly, because we're sort of short on time.
First of all, that there's still great variety among countries, and how dependent we are, and how vulnerable countries are to malfunctioning systems and attacks. I mean, at the top of dependency and then vulnerability is Estonia, for example, which is extremely digitalized country, and Sweden and many other countries. And there's 2 problems with all of this dependency we are now building up. We don't really have backup systems when they fail. What do we do then? Do we need to also build up or restore offline systems for public services? And it's not just individuals that use it, but public services, energy, financial systems, transactions, communications, airline systems, everything else is to a degree connected to the internet today, which is very vulnerable. Oh, and then accountability. That is an unresolved problem, since most of these systems are in the control or owned by private companies who run them efficiently, but when there's a problem, they often try to escape public accountability.
Thank you. Just one very brief anecdote is I was talking to someone in the US Navy last year, and they said that people had forgotten how to use the traditional navigation systems because of digital technology, and so they were having to reimpose sort of traditional map reading in the event that anything should actually break down, and that it wasn't particularly well received. Okay, we're very sort of short on time, so I'll just come to for very final remarks, Dr. Liu.
Should I respond to this power governance issue?
No, I think anything, just any final sort of thought you would like to impart to the audience.
Okay.
Really, it can be on the question or anything else.
This the last question raised, gives me a kind of illusion that we are having a Politburo meeting of the Communist Party of China. Talking about this, this is very congenial to their mindset. How to kind of. Whose power we're talking about, what kind of governance, who is taking over. So those are, I'm not, joking about these issues. What I'm thinking, as a final sort of summary is, now, the countries like China is a mammoth in size, and it's not yet find its own way to play a leading role in the world. It's evolving. We think about the reconfigurations or restructuring of the power formations. This is perfect timing for countries like China and also for the rest of the world. You think about, how to take these great opportunities at digital age in terms of the diffusion, the redirections of the power distributions. So, the emerging countries like China would play a more positive, more collaborative role, rather than this kind of traditional international politics scenario where you have this status quo power challenged by the revisionist power and so on, so forth. The conflicts, the collision were inevitable. Things like that, we have this wonderful opportunity to rethink about this. So that's how I see. Yeah.
Thank you. Giampiero, would you like to have any closing thoughts?
Yes, very quickly. I would like to close on a positive note. Much as I resent censorship and control, I must say that advanced democracies have fared not too bad in that respect. And so that's the positive note. What really worries me is that the rest of the world so far has failed to notice that and has failed to follow suit.
Thank you. And Barry, you have the last word.
Wow, thanks. Just two quick points. One on the specific question on governance. I think obviously the set of technology revolutions is going to greatly increase demands for governance that many states will not be able to meet. So this restiveness that we saw in this region and in others is going to continue for quite a while. So I think we're in a new age of where this is a normal situation until we can reset some sense of legitimacy in some countries. I think it was Shibli Telhami who said at a dinner earlier in the conference, a private conversation, but sort of what's going on in the region was sort of a situation where the new connectivity sliced through the legitimacy of some states that are somewhat less legitimate. But then I would also point to Salam Fayyad. He, at the Atlantic Council last year, he was asked, what do you think about the Arab Spring? And isn't it over and what a failure? And I thought I thought his answer was right on, where he said, and it was someone from the US who was asking the question, and he said, boy, you Westerners are really setting different standards. Your revolution took hundreds of years. And here we are a few years into a revolution in this region, and you're saying it's already over? So take a long-term perspective. And I think I'll end by saying, this is the digital age, or at least the digitally enabled age. And so we're at the very beginning, and we need to start thinking ahead and not behind.
Thank you, Barry. Thank you to all of our panelists. I'd like to thank once again Dr. Erbitsam and the organizers here for inviting us all to participate in this wonderful panel. So please join me in thanking our speakers.